8 billion. A few more. That's how many of us are currently spinning together on this third rock from the sun. Yet 15 times that number have come before us. When we look at time-lapse videos of our cities, our teeming urban sprawl, it's easy to forget we are less than 10% of all people who ever lived. The family of man has been at this a good long while. We're late to the party, fellow travelers. So, more than 100 billion stories have come before ours. More than 100 billion have stood on a mountain, gazed up at the stars, and wondered. Have stood on a shore and imagined the open sea. Have tasted wine, held a child, laughed, wept, dreamed, and disappeared. We drink the same water they did. We tend our crops in the same soil. We stack and restack the same stones, tell and retell the same stories. We trace the same edges of time. Whether we travel only 50 miles from home in our lifetimes, or transit the planet in full 50 times over, we are simply the latest chapter in a book billions of years in its writing. Welcome to this inaugural podcast from Vast Compass. Thank you for joining me. I'm Mark, and it's great to connect, to share some of the world's best destinations and the stories behind them. So, more than 100 billion beings called this place home before we arrived on the scene. They are the reason we travel. The paths they forged, the lands they settled, the imprint they left on history, those often are the components of today's modern travel itineraries. Following in their footsteps, we stand on the same mountains wondering at the same stars, and stand on the same shores imagining the same open seas. We marvel at the stones they stacked in their time. We flock to blockbuster movies based on their sagas of passion, conquest, romance, tragedy, and endurance. And perhaps if we don't flock to the movie theaters, we still binge as we stream those sagas of passion, conquest, romance, tragedy, and endurance. And I believe all of this is truer for Greece than just about any place most of us ever dream of one day seeing. And I believe all of this is truer on Santorini than just about any other place in Greece. When we look at Santorini on a map, it's clear a story is waiting to be told. In the current travel inciter from Vast Compass, you can see exactly why. The tiny archipelago looks like a broken plate, shards of a platter floating in the Aegean Sea, or like random brushstrokes and daubs of paint on a blue canvas. Because Santorini proper is barely an island. It's what remains after one of the most violent volcanic explosions in human history tore the heart out of the land and flung it across the sky. Delos is the birthplace of Apollo and is the geographic heart of the Cyclades. Well, Naxos is the largest island, and Syros is the Cyclades' most populated island. But the Cyclades includes more than 220 islands all told, yet Santorini, for most travelers, outshines mystic Delos and tops even party central Mykonos. When we, as travelers, arrive by sea today, drama in the moment is palpable. We round great bluffs and enter what is now Santorini's majestic, vast harbor, and we slowly glimpse the edges of white villages slipping their bounds, speckled here and there with blue domes, and fringed by gravity-defying terraces on which we will soon catch picture-perfect postcard sunsets. And all of this is built on the rim of a crater 1,200 feet above us. It's an experience unlike any other, and a view you never forget. As our ferry from Mykonos prepared to dock a quarter century ago, I stared at the massive wall of scree rising above us, a great sweep of talus, west to east, north to south, east to west. The main island was an unfolding panorama of raw earth from 11 to 7 o'clock on a dial. It was a great stereopticon of violence in 3D. Soil, clawed and eroded, tumbled, barren. This is not a place that was gently shaped by time. It's immediately clear that you're transiting a great scar. This is a place that somehow survived catastrophe. Of course, everything about Santorini, from its ancient ruins at impossible heights to its wine, an acquired taste that eludes many, its Byzantine churches, often just small caves carved into cold stone, its food, much of it unique to this island, even the way its vines grow in baskets hugging the earth. All of this only makes sense when you come to understand one thing. Santorini survives. It endures, despite being destroyed multiple times. But first you have a more urgent, practical thought. As you disembark in the small port and set foot on this shore and leave the open sea behind, you think, on top of this rock is where I'm going to spend my vacation? This gravel quarry of shattered basalt and sliding schist, limestone and pumice? This is what all the fuss is about. Before the postcards, before the cruise ships, before the blue doors, Santorini had another name, Straili, the round one. 3,500 years ago, 125 miles southeast from the Greek mainland, this was a complete circular island with a thriving Bronze Age city called Akrotiri. Think multi-story buildings. Think indoor plumbing. Think elegant homes with frescoes of saffron gatherers and fishermen and their nets. think trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean. This was the Edenic home of a sophisticated civilization that had figured out how to live comfortably on a volcano rising above waters 1,300 feet deep. And then around 1600 BCE, the ground beneath that civilized world liquefied, rent, rose against itself in rage. This was not a gentle eruption, folks. This was not lava flowing gracefully down slope like today's occasional glowing streaks of neon red mascara on Etna or Arenal. This was the stuff of Hollywood, VFX, an explosion with the force of several hundred atomic bombs. More than 14 cubic miles of rock and magma were blasted into the ether. Depending on whether you measure material thrown into the sky or energy expended, the Santorini eruption was 10 to 100 times more explosive than 1980's Mount St. Helens eruption in Washington state. Something I happen to know a little about, given that it caused havoc in the final weeks of my senior year in high school. So nearly 3,700 years ago, great chunks of land were launched skyward, only to fall into the sea, even as ash traveled thousands of miles, and fatal tsunamis rolled across the Aegean. And on Santorini, the center of the island collapsed into ink blue waters, and Akrotiri, that thriving city, disappeared between meters of ash. Ash from Santorini's eruption has been found at the bottom of the Nile River. There are even some who believe the toxic silt is what turned the great river blood red, as recorded in the Bible. Others cite climate disruption from the eruption as the cause of swarms of locusts and other maladies attributed to the plagues of Egypt, as Moses demanded Pharaoh set his people free from bondage. The Santorini eruption is also why many historians believe this is the real story behind mythical Atlantis, the sunken city of a long ago civilization. Plato, in about 360 BCE, writes in one of his dialogues of a circular Greek island that vanished into the sea in a single day and night. Cartography bears out his notes: concentric rings, a powerful civilization, a sudden destruction. Plato's observations match Santorini almost perfectly. But here's what makes the near-fatal blow to Santorini and burial of Akrotiri beneath suffocating ash so fascinating. There are no human remains to be found, which means people felt the island's warning and with those tremors evacuated. They took what they could, they took what mattered most, and left. By comparison, on May 18, 1980, the Mount St. Helens eruption killed 57 people directly. Santorini's eruption is rated a 6 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. Mount St. Helens has a VEI of 5. While cousins separated by exponential amounts of energy and land expanded and thrown into the sky, they are still near cousins. The broad causes of death in the Mount St. Helens incidents were its lateral blast, ashfall, and lahars, or mud flows. Specific injuries were asphyxiation, thermal wounds, and trauma. It's the deadliest volcanic event in U.S. history. And we can't help but think of those 57 souls who, despite months of warning, chose to stay in the shadow of the mountain. For a few, staying put was about personal freedom. And for some, it was about disaster tourism. For the majority, though, it was due to a red zone designation, which no-go perimeter was, alas, too small. An unprecedented blast put paid to them all, regardless of why they were within its fatal reach more than 45 years ago. And it's how I came to graduate without year-end finals. Your GPA on May 15th, that's what you graduated with. It also forestalled or canceled altogether a number of other rituals that most seniors go through before they exit their high school doors for the last time. Incidentally, it's also how I got one of my most important summer jobs. At my mom's suggestion, I stopped by a local hotel with a restaurant and large parking lot and asked if they'd hire me to power wash their building's eaves, balconies, stairs, sidewalks, everything, given it was all under a coating of volcanic ash, some 500 miles to the northeast of Mount St. Helens. Impressed by the thoroughness of the power washing job I did, and spiffing up the property overall, they onboarded me as a dishwasher in the hotel restaurant for the summer. And after a summer of my leaving the kitchen cleaner every night than any other employee had, they brought me back at Christmas to help in the dining room at their sister property, a swanky lakeside resort. And then on New Year's Eve, when the server was snowed in her cabin in the woods in the mountains, leaving the restaurant short of staff for the busiest night of the year, I was called on to begin waiting tables with zero training and also underage when it came to serving alcohol. Which of course meant that my first table was an elderly couple, and they decided to splurge on their big night out and asked me what rose wine was. Well, I knew it was pink, so I said, oh, rose wine is a mix of red and white. And they said, oh, that sounds nice. Well, despite my lack of skill as an oenophile, that summer the restaurant manager and lead chef taught me to do flambe cooking tableside. Then they offered to pay my college tuition if I'd major in hospitality and hotel management. It's funny how, looking back, the volcano's eruption shaped the course of my life. Things do, every day, of course. But those summer jobs instilled in me a real love of cooking and gave me some skills which I've been honing ever since. And while I declined the offer, generous offer, of a degree in hotel management, those businesses are still anchors in the small town economy in which I grew up. One final note. The grandfather of the man who hired me in 1980 had given my mom her first job while still in high school more than 40 years earlier. And his aunt was my dad's head bookkeeper, our neighbor and closest family friend. But returning now to ancient Santorini, having been evacuated, the city of Akrotiri patiently waited beneath 3 to 6 meters of ash for 3,600 years. Today, when you visit Akrotiri, you walk through a modern archaeological dig on elevated platforms inside a climate-controlled structure, much as when you visit Xi'an, China. You see the remnants of that ancient civilized world. Clay pipes for hot and cold water, stairways connecting neighborhoods upslope and down, streets and facades, even plaster casts of furniture where wood once stood. It's called the Minoan Pompeii. After centuries of abandonment, Santorini was resettled. Spartans arrived in the 9th century BCE and built ancient Thera high on a ridge called Mesa Vuno. Not directly by the sea, where it would have been easy to hoist tons of stone into the sky, and not simply inland, but up high. Because Santorini's next greatest enemy wasn't geologic in nature. It came from the sea, namely pirates. Aye, matey, 'tis true. Spartan control was followed on by Venetian control as a naval outpost in their growing navigational reach. The Venetians renamed it Santorini after Saint Irene. Ironically, Irene is Greek for peace. Hardly the word one would conjure considering the island's violent creation story. So Spartans and Venetians alike built fortified villages, which the Italians called castellia, with narrow, maze-like streets designed to confuse invaders. Because you see, the raiders weren't coming for gold or other riches, at least not directly. They came for human plunder, slaves. Which is why locals created a network of deep pits in which to store crops and in which to hide during piratical attacks. And it's why today's streets and lanes still zigzag with such confounding navigation. Alas, many island residents over the centuries could find themselves locked out during pirate raids. Perhaps they couldn't hear the alarm in fields below, or perhaps they were out to sea fishing. Whatever the reason, village populations could decline dramatically during spasms of what we now call human trafficking. And even though Venice had treaties with the Ottoman Empire, Turkish raids under the orders of distant pashas were another threat to contend with. And being part of the burgeoning trade routes enabled by navigation led by countries on the Mediterranean, bubonic plague was almost certainly another imperilement. Some estimates put population loss in the Eastern Med from the Black Death at 40%. Mesa Vuno today is the site of ancient Thera. The ruins appear to be sparse to the uneducated eye, in part because much of the stone, called spolia, has been reused in other projects on the island over the centuries. But archaeological work in the 1990s codified a map, locating Thera's main street, a garrison, a theater, an agora or shopping plaza, residences, temples, public buildings, and, at its lowest point, a necropolis. Few trees have grown on Santorini for millennia, meaning nearly all ancient construction on that high rise was of stone. A remaining hunk of limestone on the slopes of ancient Thera make a perfect spot on which to sit and from which to take in one of the site's most rewarding activities: plane spotting. Santorini's airport is just below, to the north and a bit west, meaning approaching jets in their final descent are below you as you sit at an elevation of nearly 1,300 feet. don't have the appetite to navigate nearly 30 switchbacks on a steep drive uphill and then still face a thirst-inducing hike in shimmering dry heat even further upslope to reach the viewpoint? Not to worry. Down below, a wide spot in the road north along the airport fence, within view of the end of runway 34, is another popular, far easier spot to claim for those on the selfie hunt with modern jets in frame. The medieval capital of Santorini wasn't Fira or Ia. It was Scaros Rock, a fortress perched on a steep promontory. Today, it's a hiking trail of rubble, a moonscape of cinder and slag. Once it was a densely packed Catholic citadel, guarding against raids. Santorini's famous architecture, the thick walls, the churches in caves, the tiny windows, the winding alleys, they were never about quaint charm or even cooling shade, symbolic blue doors, or of course the perfect selfie spot. They were about survival inside from forces on the outside.